Welcome to the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with Nicolette Hahn Niman, the author of Defending Beef. Nicolette, hey, how you doing? It's so great to see you today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Nicolette Hahn Niman is a writer, attorney, and livestock rancher. She authored the book Defending Beef, as well as the book Righteous Pork Chop, and has written numerous essays for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times. She has also written for the Atlantic, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Earth Island Journal. Nicolette is a frequent speaker at national and international conferences and was one of just 23 speakers from around the world at the Nobel Week Dialogue in 2016 in Stockholm, Sweden. She has appeared on the PBS NewsHour, the Dr. Oz Show, and in numerous films and documentaries, including Eating Animals, as well as Sustainable. And her work has been featured in Time, O Magazine, and The Guardian, among many others. Previously, she was senior attorney for the environmental organization Waterkeeper, where she focused on animal agriculture, and before that was an environmental lawyer for National Wildlife Federation. Nicolette served 2 terms on the City Commission for Kalamazoo, Michigan, and today she lives in Northern California with her 2 sons and her husband, Bill Niman, founder of the natural meat companies Niman Ranch and BN Ranch. Nicolette, today we're talking about defending beef, and I'm really excited to get into this topic because among the many themes and threads out there in the climate movement, the regenerative movement, the food and health movement, this issue seems to be one that bubbles up quite often and has a lot of misperceptions and varying views and opinions out there in the public. So maybe to kick things off, I'll just throw it right up for you. Maybe it's a bit of a softball. Why does beef need defending?
Yes. Well, I kind of wish that it didn't, because it's a kind of a frustrating process to have to try to defend something over and over again that you kind of don't feel needs to be defended. But I guess it's kind of a 2-pronged response. On the one hand, there's this whole question of the healthfulness of the food. Is it something that is good for our bodies and will sustain us, our health over the longer term? And that's an idea that's kind of been out there, I would say, since around mid-20th century. There was this kind of rise in heart disease in the industrialized world. And there were actually 2 major camps on the topic. One really felt that it related to the consumption of animal fats in the industrialized world. And then there was another group of researchers, scientists, and physicians that felt that actually the shift towards more sugar in the industrialized diet was much more important in terms of what might be triggering the rise in heart disease and other diet-related diseases. And unfortunately, the sort of the dietary fat argument kind of won the day at the time. And even though over the last couple of decades, there has been some really good and credible reevaluation of the thought process and the research, to the point where I would say the argument has actually been dismantled. But it was out there for so many decades that it's still a very mainstream belief, even among nutritionists, dietitians, and doctors. But from my perspective, the science has been broken down to the point where it's not credible anymore. So on the health side, there's still this argument that we shouldn't be eating it primarily because of the saturated fat content. On the other side, and this is kind of a little bit newer of an argument, there's this argument that meat is too ecologically damaging. It's too resource intensive. It's too water intensive, and specifically beef. The beef is the one that usually gets the focus in this arena. And then in the last decade in particular, this idea that it's too harmful to the climate, especially because of methane. So I, as a person who was kind of a lifelong environmentalist and spent 3 years specifically working as a lawyer for environmental organizations, nonprofit organizations, and 2 of those years were specifically focused on the meat industry. I'm someone who really, has kind of delved into this from, on a professional level. What does the science really say on the ecology? And then for the last 20 years, I've been living and working on a ranch and have met ranchers all over the world and really studied it from that perspective, from a practitioner's perspective. And so I have increasingly become convinced that the ecological argument is just very, very wrong on many levels. And so what my defense of beef is kind of this two-pronged, refutation of these 2 sort of, I'd say almost commonly held beliefs that beef is not good for your health and that beef is damaging to the environment. And so the more I learned about it, the more I felt that someone who had a kind of a not just a deep understanding, but a kind of a nuanced understanding because of these various different components to my background. Someone needed to really make a cohesive argument that beef was valuable food for our health, and also ecologically, when done well, beneficial.
Yeah. I'm really, really excited we have the opportunity to dive into this with you and unpack this a little bit for our audience. And I have found, in the years I've been doing this kind of related work, that this beef and animal issue seems to be among the most polarizing out there, at least in the portion of our national demographic that finds the anthropomorphic climate change concern to be genuine. And what's amazing to me, and what many Americans aren't aware of, is that globally, virtually everybody seems to be in agreement and understanding that human impacted climate change is very real, even though here in the United States, there seems to be some confusion about this. But within the arena of folks who are taking that threat seriously, this seems to be one of the most polarizing, divisive issues, which is astonishing for those of us who are engaged directly in agriculture, and especially regenerative agriculture. And, we collaborate with dozens and dozens of farmers and ranchers at many scales. And not one yet in all of these years have I come across a farmer or a rancher who says, yeah, we can maintain and steward soil and landscapes and ecosystems and food production without animals. And particularly the bovine ruminant animals. So I'm hoping, and your book is so well documented, I'm going to show it to our audience that are looking at the video version of this here. And of course, audio, you're not seeing this, but it's such a beautiful book published by our friends at Chelsea Green Publishing. And the book is so well documented. And I'm hoping that you can paint a picture for us of the scene, if you will, of cattle grazing on grasslands, the soil ecology, the water, the wildlife, the biodiversity. Because I think a lot of folks have a very different picture in mind when thinking about this issue.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you said so much, and I just want to respond quickly to a couple of points you made. First of all, I have traveled around the world quite a bit in various contexts and in talking a lot of times in talking about beef and in other, capacities where I'm traveling. And I'm always really struck by how the farming and ranching community in other parts of the world is not arguing that climate change is not happening. So it's still a uniquely American phenomenon, pretty much, that is still a pretty widely held view in certain quarters of the agricultural community, although I do think that's shifting. I have noticed a dramatic difference from 5 or 10 years ago, that there's more and more acceptance of it. And also interest in the idea of, okay, what can agriculture do? How can we be proactively preparing for these changes? And also, how can we be making our own practices better so that we're not contributing to the problem? So I think that's kind of how I see where that situation is. And then with respect to this whole question of the role of animals, I mean, I was explaining this issue and thinking about it and writing about it for a long time before I ever heard something that Alan Savory said, the wildlife ecologist from Zimbabwe, who has done such an amazing job establishing sort of holistic management principles in grazing and agriculture in many parts of the world. And the way he said it, that just made so much sense to me. And I think it's such a beautiful sort of encapsulation of the whole book that I wrote, Defending Beef. And that is that essentially the globe evolved for millions of years. And for millions and millions of years, there were very large herds of grazing animals. And that was a very important element of the Earth's ecology. And that only in fairly recent times, so like about the last 100,000 years, which is a long time, but it's very short in geological time, many of those animals either disappeared entirely or their populations dwindled dramatically. So we have today just kind of a remnant of the wild grazing herds, whether they were prehistoric animals or things like caribou, which are still on the earth but are in much smaller numbers now. And you can just look at it when I give talks and I show slides of the sort of the remnants of large grazing herds that are still on the earth, caribou being one of them. And we also have things like Cape buffalo and wildebeest and the bison in the American West, although they're a tiny fraction of what they once were. But what I like about showing them to people, the visualization is so important. You can see that there are large numbers of animals, and they're very densely congregated as they move across the landscape, and they do move. And so what Alan Savory said a few years ago, and I've met him many times, and I have a strong connection with him, and have read his seminal book about holistic management. But he said in these words that just clicked in my mind is that we need a proxy, a replacement for the disappeared wild animals that once covered the globe. And so that is why he and I also strongly believe in this idea that the grazing animals, like cattle in particular, are not just, okay. They're essential for the ecological function of the earth. And you can, kind of break it down into a lot of different components of why that is. But I think just thinking of it in that context is really helpful. If you think, the vast majority of, for millions and millions of years, there were tens of millions of years, there were large grazing herds, and they're largely absent today. So we need to sort of figure out how to have that same kind of ecological impact on the earth in order for ecosystems to function properly, and especially for the soil to function properly. And so that is kind of a cornerstone of the Defending Beef book. And I have to say, when I first started researching and writing the book, the original version of it, I didn't even know what I just said. Like, I had a lot of other reasons that I thought I could make a great argument for cattle. But this whole idea that they are absolutely essential for soil biology and microbiology, and that it goes way back to this long sort of geological perspective of Earth's long existence, was something I did not understand until much more recently, and when I started writing this book. That's kind of the short version of the argument.
Yeah, it's so important. And I want to pick up on that and add a little to it. When we were researching for my book, Why on Earth, and our Soil Stewardship Handbook, we were looking at the numbers globally for carbon concentration in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and methane and some other compounds, and carbon in the living canopies of the forests, etc., carbon in the living soils worldwide. And looking at those aggregate numbers, we essentially saw that a 10% increase in soil carbon worldwide from the natural sequestering of atmospheric carbon would be tantamount to sequestering virtually all of the industrial and fossil carbon that we've released since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so there's this very important nexus in the soil itself, right? Vis-a-vis the climate and carbon cycling. I was hoping you could unpack that for us a little bit as well and help us understand, what's going on with the large grazing animals vis-a-vis that kind of carbon, soil, climate, atmosphere connection.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of important kind of foundational points on that. One is that there's been this very large migration of carbon into the atmosphere, and that a lot of that has come from the soil. And that has been well documented, that there's been a dramatic loss, basically starting around, the mid 1800s, when the sort of industrialization process really started happening. But we have kind of a long human history that has been impacting the life and health of the soil. And a lot of that relates to the plow, and I was very surprised when I was, again, sort of in my research, I was uncovering, Wes Jackson saying things like nothing has done more damage to the earth than the plow, and it's something that most people, again, especially people outside of agricultural circles, would never have thought of that, I don't think. But it's just this basic idea that the earth itself has kind of a protective vegetative blanket. And whenever you run a plow through it or anything that's kind of ripping it apart, you're not just taking that protective vegetative blanket off, but you're ripping all of the very complex network of roots and filaments that are below ground. And you're doing tremendous damage to the whole sort of subterranean ecosystem that's down there. That is, I think just in the last decade, there's been a great deal more awareness of how complex that below ground environment is, and how the microorganisms and all the living entities that are down there, whether they're there's been a lot of attention to earthworms, and they're very important, but there's much more to it than that. And so whenever we plow the ground, we're sort of dramatically injuring the health of that whole system. And we've been doing this for thousands of years, not just since the 1850s. But so there's this kind of collective impact of agriculture and other human activity that we've been having on how much life and health and carbon are in the soil, and those things are all kind of connected. And then we have this sort of rapid acceleration of that whole process happening since the industrialization, the sort of industrial revolution. And so that, that's kind of a big piece of it. There's been this migration from the soil to the atmosphere. And so when you talk about sort of trying to come up with ways to get more carbon back into the soil, not just to take it out of the atmosphere, but also to improve the health of the soil. And then something that I've become much more focused on and interested in the last couple of years in particular is just this whole question of the importance of doing that in order to create more healthful food. Like these are sort of simple concepts in a way, but in another way, we rarely hear these things being discussed in the same conversation. And I've gotten very intrigued by work of people like Fred Provenza, who've shown how when you have soil that isn't healthful enough, it impacts, when it's not biologically vibrant enough, it impacts the health of the plant that's growing there. And then even that affects the health of the animal that's grazing it. And then, of course, there's a lot of research now showing that modern versions of fruits, vegetables, grains, even animal foods that we're consuming have a much lower nutrient content. They have lower nutritional value to humans. And a lot of that is being connected to this lack of life and health in the soil. So all of this stuff is connected. And the reason why, Erin, you asked me about the role of animals in that. So animals, by being there, and they were there for millions of years, having this impact, these wild grazing animals, and then of course, domesticating grazing animals have been around for quite a while as well, but in the thousands of years, not in the millions of years. But where an animal treads, it has a number of impacts just by virtue of, for example, pushing seeds into the ground. Where it grazes, it clips vegetation, which fosters growth, and also allows other species of plants that are later sprouting to come up because they have more sunshine that are actually reaching them as seedlings. So there's research from all around the world showing that there's greater diversity of vegetation where you have grazing animals, whether domesticated or wild. And then, of course, there's the impact of the manure on the sort of, not just, people talk a lot of times about the fact that manure has nitrogen, phosphorus, et cetera, in it. But even more importantly, perhaps, is the fact that manure has a lot of microorganisms in it. And so between the nutrients, the moisture, and the microorganisms, manure actually has a dramatically positive effect on the healthfulness of the soil, how much life is in there, and ultimately how much water is retained in there, which allows more life to exist in the soil. And so the grazing animal, if you don't manage it, again, to sort of go back to the Alan Savory concept of proxy for a wild animal, if you manage it in a sort of thoughtful way, usually one that kind of mimics the disappeared wild animal that might have been there, you will have tremendously beneficial effects from the presence of that animal. It needs to be kind of moving. It needs to be, the land needs to be resting. But the fact that there's that grazing, the cropping of the vegetation, the addition of the manure and the urine back into the soil, and the addition of the microorganisms that are, and also even just recently I was reading something about saliva and the saliva of the animal having an impact on the growth of the plants. So there are just many, many levels, some of which are still being figured out, where it has a positive effect on how much vegetation you have, how much diversity of vegetation, and not just the diversity of the vegetation, but everything from the diversity of microorganisms, the diversity of the insect life. All of these things have been shown in many, many studies from around the world to be more vibrant, more abundant, just more diverse where you have the grazing animals. And they've actually done quite a few studies in every place from Europe, Asia, United States, where animals were removed from a plot of land. A lot of times it's like a park or something like that. And there's a belief that this will help kind of help the land to recover. And there's been a sort of surprising result over and over again, to the point where it's not even surprising anymore, that the health of the ecosystem declines. And that's something that Alan Savory talks about as well, that in his work as a wildlife ecologist, that a lot of the work that he was doing when he was younger, they were trying to reduce numbers of grazing animals, whether they were wild or domesticated. And that again and again, he was witnessing for himself in the African landscapes that the health of the whole ecosystem was declining when they would remove these animals. And that's what kind of triggered his whole life's work of trying to figure out, how do we use the grazing animals as an ecological renovator and protector, rather than, viewing them as inherently damaging.
Yeah, and I think, for a lot of people, that is a major paradigm shift right there.
Right.
I was struck, we've had my friend Brooke LeVan, co-founder of Sustainable Settings, a beautiful biodynamic ranch here in Colorado. did a multi-year study with the NRCS. And this study included a number of different farms and ranches, ranging from conventional to organic and biodynamic practices. And in the case of sustainable settings, combination of biodynamic regenerative practices and rotational grazing and some of the methods recommended by Alan Savory and others, the soil carbon levels grew so dramatically that they literally, after a handful of years, went off the charts, like literally had to change the vertical axis increments the NRCS did to accommodate the results they were seeing at sustainable settings. And so we hear, whether it's through the Savory Institute's work or the ecosystem restoration camp movement worldwide, and they rebranded as ecosystem restoration communities, we're seeing in places all around the world, including full-blown deserts, this ability to restore landscapes, ecosystems, and thereby sequester incredible amounts of carbon, while also significantly impacting the hydrology, the water flows in those regions. And I know one of the chapters in your book is dedicated to the water. And I was hoping you could unpack that a bit for us as well, because I think we see some of the old studies that have probably been debunked by now, indicating, to raise one beef cow or steer, you need so many hundreds of gallons of water. But this is creating a significant misperception about what that actually really means in the landscape, right?
Yes. And first of all, I just want to pause and say I love the way I don't know if it was intentional or not, the way you said restore, because I hadn't ever thought about that word that way. It is about getting back in, storing again something that once was there, the carbon and the water and the life into the soil and into the landscape. So yes, water is something that I've focused on a lot over the years as an environmental lawyer. Actually, both the job I did at National Wildlife Federation as well as the job I did at Waterkeeper were focused a lot, almost primarily on water. So it's something I've worked on and thought about a lot and read a lot about. And I think it is one of the biggest misperceptions around beef specifically, because there have been these kind of, they were around long before memes existed, but there were these things flying around saying that, your hamburger, was, a lake's worth of water, or whatever, ridiculous exaggeration. And when I sort of actually looked at the research and looked at the studies and understood what the numbers meant, I was really surprised at how false that argument is, because for many different reasons. And I kind of break it down in some detail in my book, Defending Beef. But this, again, kind of the short version is that, for one thing, the vast, vast, vast majority of water that goes into beef anywhere in the world, but certainly here in the United States, is from rainfall. It's not water that's being extracted from the ground. It's not water that's being, taken from a lake or from a municipal water system or whatever. It's rainfall. Okay. So it's water that would be there anyways. And then the question is, well, what happens with it? And the really interesting part that I think really surprises people is that water gets, sort of captured in the soil and it ends up being stored essentially in vegetation. And as we've been talking about, vegetation has a really valuable role in protecting the soil, protecting the below ground environment, protecting the whole ecosystem. And actually, that whole grass system or, whatever vegetative system you're talking about really benefits by this animal impact. You sort of have to have the grazing of it in order for it to be diverse and for the growth to be triggered and so forth. And grazing animals do that. But it's that water in the vegetation that makes up the vast majority of the water that's in those water footprint numbers. So from my perspective, that water really doesn't even belong in that number. And a group of scientists a number of years ago at UC Davis also felt that way and made that argument. And they did a detailed analysis of how much water would go into a pound of beef if you didn't count that number, if you didn't count the water that's in the grass, essentially, and the natural rainfall that's in the grass. Okay. And what they found was that the number that beef is still, more water intensive than some other foods. That's undeniable. But it was actually comparable to other foods that people commonly eat, such as rice. And so it dramatically reduced. It's not an outsized water footprint. It's a water footprint that's, comparable to many other things that people already eat. And so I think that's just, to me, it's kind of a context point. You need to think of it in the greater context. And then the other piece of that is that where you have ecosystems with grazing animals that are well managed, you actually have more water stored in that ecosystem. You have more water stored in the soil, dramatically more. And that's been, quantified in a number of different places in a number of different studies, and it's been shown to be a dramatic increase. And also, you're storing more water in the vegetation that's on the landscape because you have more vegetation. There's more, just held in the ecosystem because you have more plant growth because of the presence of the grazing animals. So the grazing animals actually, again, when well managed, it's not the cow, it's the how, it's the phrase I like to say over and over again. If they're well managed, you will actually be essentially protecting water. And as I talk about as well in defending beef, that's the quantity side of it. But there's also a water quality side, which is, the pollution. Are we polluting? And again, there's been a lot of suggestion over the years that beef cattle cause a lot of water pollution. But in reality, where you have well-managed grazing animals, that sort of vegetative cover that you will have in a grazing landscape is extremely effective at filtering the water that's going to the ground, and in many cases also ending up in surface water. And so again, this has been quantified in a number of different studies, you actually have cleaner water where you have grazing animals than, especially compared to something like crop production. So it's the water side, to me, there's that quantity argument and there's that quality argument. And on both sides of it, I think the question's a lot more complex than people tend to realize. And I think there's a very strong, pro beef argument on both quantity and quality.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. And to give a shout out and connect another dot to another wonderful Chelsea Green author, Judith Schwartz, who's written a book, Cows Save the Planet, as well as a book on water. And we actually did two different podcast conversations with her about each of one each. She's helped connect some of those dots as well. And I think one of the things that may not be intuitive to folks that you're hitting on here is the fertility boosting effect of the grazing animals, right? And to emphasize the point you're making, when we're doing cereal or grass crop production, which is rice or corn, often we're putting in these nutrients, right, that are flowing into the water, infiltrating into the surface water, the creeks, the ponds, the major river deltas, causing incredible adverse ecological impacts. And I think it's especially when we get into the kind of, what do we call it? Frankenmeat or faux meat, you call it in the book, thinking about, well, is it better to make, protein substitutes from crops like soy versus grazing cows on undisturbed grassland landscapes? I think it's really important to kind of unpack this whole thing a little bit more. And I was hoping with your background and expertise, you could tell us a bit more about the adverse impacts on water we're seeing from conventional crop production worldwide.
Yeah. So there's absolutely this whole question of chemical runoff and chemical seepage into groundwater, and even, of course, chemicals that are present in the air surrounding these fields, and dramatic impacts on wildlife, whether they're migrating, monarchs or other birds. In fact, there's a lot of really good research that I cite, some of it in my book, about migratory birds, and how where you have a kind of a grazing landscape compared to a crop field, how much better it is, and how much more robust the populations tend to be. And you can just go out into a field and see a dramatic difference in that regard, literally just on your own. Just walk out into a grazing pasture and then walk out into a crop field, and you'll see very little wildlife in the crop field versus a pasture, which is, like a sort of Amazonian rainforest type environment, where there's just lots of teeming life. And one thing that I've noticed over the years myself is the sounds. If you're in the middle of a pasture or a grazed landscape, you're going to hear a lot of birds, and you're going to hear a lot of insects, and you're going to feel the presence of a lot of life. And if you walk into the middle of a conventional corn or soy field, it's almost like being in a large parking lot. There's a dramatic difference that's just visible to the eye and to the ear. So I would say, and then the other piece of the sort of conventional crop land versus a grazed area is that you're basically, the whole thing that you're doing there is you're sort of scraping off and replacing, essentially a natural environment that can be the home, the habitat for not just the birds, but insects and snakes and so many other things. And, I'm always struck when we have visitors here at our ranch. They're so taken with how much wildlife is present here. And if you were to walk through a conventional field, you just wouldn't have that same experience. And you're going to, in addition to the absence of the wildlife and the presence of chemicals, if it's a conventional farm, but there's also, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. There was one other point I was going to make on that, and it just escaped me, but it'll come back to me at some point, I'm sure. There's a dramatic difference, though. You're going to see on the sort of ecological level. Oh, soil erosion. I'm sorry. That's it. Yes, so there's this protective blanket that we've already talked about a few times, that is created by the sort of dense and diverse vegetation that's going to exist in a grazed environment. And you don't have that in a crop production setting. And this has really been something that struck me, again, on a sort of a personal firsthand account level, when I was driving through, over the years, a number of different times, as I've been driving through either Iowa, sort of corn and soy territory, or Idaho, where I have a sister who lives there. And I was driving through potato fields, and I've never seen, it was outside of the growing season, and I've never seen such a desolate landscape. It was dry, gray, dusty dirt, and I do say dirt, not soil, everywhere. I mean, as far as the eye could see, for miles. And I was just, oh my God, because the irony of, I remembered I was being interviewed at a radio station in San Francisco by a vegan, very nice woman, but a vegan radio producer who had me on her show, and she was eating a potato, and that was her vegan lunch. And I was thinking to myself, as I was driving through those potato fields, like, in her mind, she's doing something that is helpful and ecologically beneficial by not eating animals and eating this potato. And then I'm driving through these desolate landscapes, and I'm thinking, this is not ecologically healthy here. And I just, it's the kind of stuff that I wish, more people would be out in the landscapes more often and actually seeing what farming and ranching actually looks like in the real world, because rather than just sitting in their, urban offices with ideas.
That's what I found.
That was Siri. Creepy.
Siri agrees.
Siri's helping. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think I might have gotten on a couple tangents there, but hopefully I answered the question that you asked.
You did. And also I think wove in a few really important themes. And this exact thing you're speaking to is something that has become abundantly clear to me over the last several years. Not to pick on any particular friend of ours who might be vegan or urban, but one of the things I've certainly noticed is that a lot of the folks who have the misperceptions around the role of grazing animals in ecological stewardship and restoration tend to be urban and tend not to spend much time at farms and ranches.
Yes.
And from my perspective, for a variety of reasons, and you kind of get at this too with some of your discussion around children's immunity, which I want to be sure to ask about, but for a variety of reasons, it seems to me one of the things that would be really, really helpful as we are species-wide confronted by so many challenging, systemic, interconnected situations is for more of us to get out and spend time at farms and ranches, especially those of us who are urban dwellers, especially those of us who are educated urban dwellers who have, the privilege of the time and resources where maybe on a Saturday it's relatively feasible for us to get out of town and visit a farm or a ranch. This is me, and I'm going to ask you, if you could wave your magic wand question in a few minutes, but this is part of what my magic wand response would involve. I think it would help all of us to see that interconnectivity more between the agricultural and the urban communities. And back on the biodiversity piece, in your chapter on biodiversity, you devote a whole chapter to this. You mention a Nature Conservancy study looking at ponds and songbirds, just to drive this point home. Not only do you have the anecdotal evidence, right, of folks visiting your ranch, and I know what this is like. Right here, I'm at a small regenerative farm, Elk Run, outside of the Boulder Lions area in Colorado, and I can hear the birds often, even from my office. But in addition to the anecdotal pieces, you provide a good bit of scientific studies that are looking at this biodiversity impact. And obviously biodiversity, along with climate and water and some of these other major issues we're facing, is one of the most important. So I was hoping maybe you could just tell us a bit about that Nature Conservancy study and why we ought to know about it.
Well, I didn't know about vernal pools until I moved to California. It was not even a term I was familiar with, but that's what that study was specifically looking at. And it's another example of how we think we know something, and then we actually sort of try to research it and document it, and we find the story's quite different. So there was actually a fair amount of controversy surrounding vernal pools. These are sort of ephemeral pools that just appear periodically, sort of small ponds on open landscapes in California, and I'm sure other parts of the West, but I know this is particularly an issue in California. And for many years, there was a kind of a movement within the environmental community that we needed to get cattle off of these areas because it was believed that the vernal pools were really important, and we had cattle on a lot of these landscapes where the vernal pools would seasonally appear. And so the feeling was, oh, they're harming it. The plant life and the animal life in those vernal pools is being injured by the presence of cattle. So there was kind of a movement to get cattle out of those areas. And the Nature Conservancy decided to study this and try to understand, well, what does it take to make a healthy vernal pool environment? And actually, the person who did this study expressed quite a bit of surprise at the results, because when they started this study, they weren't exactly sure. A lot of studies are done with a predetermined outcome that people want to get to. But this was actually, I believe, a study where they were trying to understand, how do we create a healthy environment for the preservation of these really ecologically unique vernal pools. And they wanted to preserve them because there are quite a few species of animals, wild animals, that have been found in these vernal pools that are extremely rare. Okay, so there was a kind of a feeling like, oh God, we got to get cattle out of these areas. Okay. And so a multi-year study was undertaken looking at the vernal pool environments, looking at the cattle, and trying to sort of measure the impact. And at the result of the study was that they discovered that where you had cattle present in vernal pool situations, you had healthier vernal pools. You had more, and you had more species living in them. And you basically had a healthier ecosystem that existed as it should have, because of course vernal pools would have evolved during times when there were large numbers of grazing animals on the landscape. And in California specifically, we had something like 18 megafauna species that included not just the elk. A lot of people are familiar that the Thule elk were here in larger numbers at some point in time, and not, in the not too distant past, but there were also things like camels that existed in California, and other large, two types of elephant related animals that existed in prehistoric times. And so you had these big, heavy animals on the landscape that were having all kinds of ecological effects on the landscape over millions of years, and they created ecosystems. And now that most of those animals are all gone, just tiny numbers of elk remain, and then some deer, and not much else from the wild side of things. And so it turns out the Nature Conservancy study really seemed to bolster the argument that having domesticated animals that would serve as proxies for those disappeared wild animals and sort of have impacts on the landscape that would preserve the ecosystems was really important. And so the Nature Conservancy study actually helps make the argument that you need to have these, especially as Alan Savory points out, cattle uniquely because they're large, heavy animals. That's often been said why they're so ecologically damaging. But as he argues, and I really agree with him, is they are actually uniquely valuable because so many of these disappeared, the musk ox and the mammoth and all these other animals that once roamed in large numbers on our landscapes and are not really here anymore. Yeah. We need to have things that are somewhat similar to that in their weight and their size. And so the impact is more similar. And so I love that study too. It's very kind of like, mind bending and, orthodox shattering and everything else. And so, yeah. And I didn't know anything about any of that until moving to California and learning about that particular ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, just to give another shout out, and I'm going to show your book again to our video viewing audience, Defending Beef, a beautiful book that is extremely well documented, published by Chelsea Green Publishing. And I'll remind our audience, this is the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're visiting with Nicolette Hahn Niman, the author of Defending Beef, and an extraordinary attorney and defender of nature and ecosystems. And I want to be sure to mention that you can get the book at chelseagreen.com, and you can use the code YOE35. That's for Why on Earth's 35% discount that Chelsea Green offers our audience as part of our partnership when you get the book. And you can also go to whyonearth.org to find on our partners and supporters page Chelsea Green, along with a number of others who make our podcast series possible, whom I'll thank in just a moment. And I want to be sure to mention too that you can connect with Nicolette on her Facebook page, which is called Defending Beef. And of course, we'll include the links for all of these resources in our show notes. And she also has a Defending Beef presence on Twitter, or X as it's now known. And so, yes, a very big shout out to Chelsea Green Publishing. Again, the code is YOE35 to take advantage of that generous discount they offer to our audience. And a special thanks also to Purium Organic Superfoods. I've got mine right here. This is a delicious organic greens blend that I enjoy very frequently. A big shout out to Waylay Waters, regeneratively and biodynamically grown hemp infused aromatherapy soaking salts. Thanks to Earth Hero Sustainable Products. A thank you to Profitable Purpose Consulting. Also to Soilworks Biodynamic Garden Preparations. Of course, Earth Coast Productions, that has a huge hand in making our podcast series possible. And finally, a very special thank you to all of our Y on Earth community ambassadors, many of whom are giving on a monthly basis. And if you're not yet in our monthly giving program and you'd like to be, you can go to yonearth.org and click on the donate button and set all of that up at whatever level works best for you. If you'd like to contribute at a $33 or greater level per month, we will send you at least one jar of the Waylay Waters aromatherapy soaking salts monthly as a thank you gift. So be sure to check that out and support the podcast that way if you're able. And one of the many benefits you get as an ambassador includes access to our resources, behind the scenes resources that include video recordings from multiple conferences, seminars, and symposia that we've hosted and or participated in, and our behind the scenes segments with many of our podcast guests, which we'll also be doing with Nicolette right after this main interview. So in order to access those behind the scenes segments, you have to be enrolled in our ambassador program. So encourage you to join. It's a lot of fun and a lot of great folks worldwide doing amazing work. And so, Nicolette, we've been talking quite a lot about the ecological side of this coin, and you had mentioned right at the outset that we're talking about really two sides to this coin when thinking about beef in particular. And so the other is diet and health and impacts on diet and health. And I want to be sure to get to the bioavailable nutrients, the omega-3 fatty acids. And so before doing that, as a bit of a segue, I thought I'd circle back and ask you about this children's immunity thing that you mentioned in the book, because this is also, and I'm a parent as well, this is also a really important topic, right? And we want our kids to thrive. And one of the things that's happening, especially for those of us, again, in the urban settings, is that the kiddos aren't getting exposed to some of the good things nature has to offer quite to the same degree, right? So could you unpack that for us, and we'll seg into the dietary discussion from there?
Yeah, so there is this whole question of sort of urban and suburban lifestyles versus sort of how we've evolved over, tens of thousands of years, and our, pre-human ancestors, over 100,000 years ago. And if we think about how we're living today, our daily lives, they are so radically different from how we would have been living for the vast majority of the time we've been on Earth, in our pre-human ancestors. And actually, I'm getting kind of interested in this in a sort of broader context of everything from lighting, like we live not by the sun, and which should tell us when it's time to go to bed, time to rise, et cetera. We have all this artificial lighting, and now we have this super artificial lighting that has this weird, I thought I was kind of imagining it at first, but I have noticed myself that I have negative effects, whether it's health, feeling kind of headachy or dizzy from certain types of artificial lighting. So, and it turns out those are quite widespread. So I have a lot of thoughts about just how we're living today and how different that is from how we would have been living, and how we evolved and how we've been living for such a very, very long time. But the sort of immunity side of that is that we lived, of course, sort of out in nature and amongst, and in contact with plants, animals of all types, and soils for the sort of the vast majority of our existence as a species, and as the species that preceded us, that we evolved from. And now we live in these very sanitized environments where we're in buildings. I lived in New York City for 5 years, so I'm, very familiar, and I've lived in other big urban environments as well. But, I really was really aware at that time how much I was on cement, concrete, asphalt, metal, stone. You're kind of not, in contact with the soil, not in contact with plants, just kind of what you would have been around as a human forever until very recently in time, and how sort of unnatural that was and how many different health effects that could have, and I noticed I had a sort of low-level insomnia the whole time I lived in New York City for 5 years. I thought I actually had insomnia, and then I married Bill Niman, moved to the ranch, and slept like a baby first night, literally. And I realized, I don't have insomnia. It's just living in Manhattan. So in any case, we have kind of divorced ourselves from these natural environments. And one of the things that has been super interesting is this whole idea that as a species, we were kind of coexisting and living alongside and even in really close proximity with not just wild animals, but domesticated animals. And actually, there are these very interesting paintings I've seen from France in the Middle Ages where people are actually sleeping with their livestock and so forth because it, kept them warm. And it was also a way to just, watch out for your animals and make sure they weren't being stolen or, who knows all the different reasons people were doing it. But people were living in very close proximity for much of human history, and the migrations that happened around the world, a lot of them happened with, goats and cattle. And so we were sort of constantly interchanging diseases, and we were developing sort of population-wide immunity to a lot of diseases because we were being exposed to them by virtue of being near those animals. And so one of the really interesting things that happened in the sort of modern medical research was a few decades ago when there began to be this pretty dramatic rise in food allergies and also asthma among children. It was realized that the Amish were a community that was almost absent of both of these conditions, that children were not experiencing very much food allergy or asthma. And so you were seeing a pretty dramatic rise in industrialized countries, including the United States, and almost none in Amish community. And so they called it the Amish effect, in fact. And so there began to be research being done in lots of different places around the world trying to figure this out. And there's a pretty solid case that's been made now that it has to do with the exposure to livestock. And because the Amish are not just typical farmers, like there's a lot of farming in the United States that's not Amish. And as we know, the vast majority of farming now is not diversified farming. It's monocrop. And so, you can live on a corn and soy farm or, a farm that's just raising other grains or whatever. And maybe there's no livestock there. But the unique thing about the Amish farming was it's diversified and it almost always has livestock there. So they kind of started homing in on this idea that livestock were essential for this sort of immunity boost that it came to be believed was the reason children on Amish farms were not getting food allergies and were not getting asthma. Not that there's zero, but pretty close to zero in those populations. And so taking that kind of broadening that concept, we as sort of modern humans living in mostly urban and suburban environments, we're kind of missing out on this opportunity to get exposure to all kinds of, microorganisms in our environments, from soil, from animals, from plants. And it's, everything from perhaps pandemics, like the COVID pandemic that we obviously all just recently experienced. We're just more vulnerable as a population now to lots of different kinds of problems, whether they're infectious diseases or allergies or things like asthma. And that may sound kind of hokey to someone who hasn't been hearing about this, but there's really quite a lot of science on this now. And ironically, again, kind of not the cow, it's the how, where you have large concentrated forms of animal agriculture, it can have a negative effect, lots of different kinds of negative effects on human health. But also there hasn't really been nearly as much showing of a positive impact on immunity for people living in those environments, because you're actually, first of all, the kinds of exposure that you're going to get are different. And you don't have that sort of daily interaction with healthy animals that are going to help your body develop immunity and just ability to cope with all different kinds of microorganisms that you get when you are on a more diversified farm that has a regular interaction with healthy animals. So, it's a super interesting topic that I think there's a lot of research going on. The research I cite in the book comes from various parts of the world, in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. But I think, interestingly, just on PBS, just like a couple of years ago, I saw something about asthma, and they were talking about it, and they said, if you can possibly be around animals of any kind, that's good. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I swear, 20 years ago, they would have been saying, if you have asthma, avoid animals. But I think, there's a growing understanding of the importance of exposing yourself to things in order to be healthier. And even with food allergies, they're starting to use exposure therapy more. So, I don't know if I said everything that you were hoping I would talk about or not, but
this was, it's perfect. And really the emphasis on healthy animals, right? So when we're talking about these issues, what we're not talking about, just to be crystal clear, are the concentrated animal feeding units, otherwise known as feedlots, where conditions are very different than naturally grazing animals out on pasture, right? It's a very different type of system. And when you're talking about healthy animals in particular, that's of course related in part to them eating diverse, nutrient-dense foods. And for us humans, this is also critical. And you point out that with grass-fed, pasture-ranged beef, we are getting a whole suite of very important nutrition that often isn't available through sort of vegetarian processed food alternatives or other foods that we might be eating these days, especially in the modern industrial context. And I was hoping that you could walk us through what's going on and why are these nutrients particularly bioavailable, as you point out, and how is this impacting bones, muscles, brains, the good functioning of mind, body, spirit, if you will, for each of us as humans?
Yeah, well, my background is as a biologist. That was my major in undergrad, and I also had this sort of very long history as a child and, growing up with my parents who were very focused on sort of being out in nature and eating good food and getting lots of exercise. And so I had this kind of focus on health and how do you live healthfully that goes back since, literally birth. And, one of the things that has always just sort of inherently made sense to me is, again, to sort of think about our evolution as a species and what were we doing and what have we always done, and therefore our sort of physiology is constructed in such a way that expects to get certain things. And I think it's very important to note that we began eating as a species. We began, and our sort of, again, our pre-human ancestors began eating meat over 3 million years ago. So that's a lot of time during which we as a species were evolving with that being a key component of our diet. And, there's all kinds of arguments about how much and how necessary and blah, blah, blah. But there's no doubt whatsoever that we've been eating meat for a very, very long time, and that it was a key component of our evolution. There's so much nourishment in meat that it helped us to grow bigger brains, but it was also the complexity of hunting, which is said to have contributed to the fact that we evolved bigger brains. And we just evolved sort of more complex societies, more complex communities and relationships with one another in order to be able to hunt and to be able to prepare the meat. And meat has been one of these foods that for a very, very long time has been cooked. In fact, I don't know if you've read that book by Richard Wrangham, Catching Fire, which I love. And I had the pleasure of spending time with him when I was at the Nobel event, actually. And his whole argument is that we actually were cooking, that cooking has been a really important part of our evolution. And that maybe one of the reasons why some of the pathogens that are more concerning are from meat in our food system is because of the fact that we never really evolved to eat meat raw. It's one of the foods that we, for a very, very long time, have been cooking. And so he argues, haven't really evolved the sort of systems to counter the pathogens that occur in meat. So there's no debate whatsoever that it's been an essential part of our evolution for a variety of different reasons. And again, if you sort of think of it from that perspective, I think it's easy to understand that our physiology is built to kind of expect those nutrients to come to us. And a lot of other foods that have, for example, protein is a food that, a macronutrient that we get a lot of from meat, fish, dairy, eggs. And then, of course, there are plant sources to it as well. But what people very often fail to understand is that difference in bioavailability, like how well can your body actually utilize it? And so when you look at a nutritional label for a food and it says it has 5 grams of protein in it or whatever, that doesn't mean your body's going to be able to utilize 5 grams. And the studies have been done, and again, kind of, objective sources like the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, they have huge divisions that study nutrition and health and diet, and they just emphasize over and over again in their documents that there's almost no way to replace the foods that come from animals, whether it's eggs, meat, fish, because they are so high in protein and many other nutrients, but also because the form that they come in is of such high quality. And in fact, there's a whole thing called a protein quality index. And so a lot of people think just by eating soy or just by eating, potatoes, again, you're going to get enough protein. And in fact, there's a whole, which I think is a kind of an absurd, but there's a whole narrative out there that we eat too much protein in the industrialized world. I think actually that is totally untrue. But in any case, we won't get bogged down in that point. But regardless, you won't get the same quality of protein from non-animal based foods. So for me, it kind of goes back to that evolutionary argument. And then there's sort of what I would call kind of an emerging body of science that's showing that the way food is raised impacts what's available nutritionally, and that there are actually thousands of compounds contained in food that are not on a nutritional label at all. They're just sort of beginning to be identified, these phytochemicals, and they're not just available in plants, vegetables and fruits, but they're also available in animal-based foods, meat, milk, and eggs. And how much of those chemicals, those naturally occurring chemicals, are present depends on the way the animal was raised. So having an animal in a healthful environment, and as Fred Provenza shows in his study and in his books, a diverse environment where they can graze on a lot of different kinds of plants is really important to producing food that is supportive of vibrant health over the long term. So you can substitute, you can get something that contains calcium, you can get something that contains protein, blah, 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 on a nutritional label. You can do that quite easily. You can construct a diet that would appear to meet your nutritional needs. I am more and more convinced that if you are eating foods that are from an industrial system, especially processed foods, I'm reading a whole book right now about ultra-processed foods called Ultra Processed People by a British doctor, and excellent book that I recommend to people, anyone who's interested in this topic. It's basically making the argument that the core of what's wrong with sort of health in the industrialized world is how much processed food is being consumed. And so much of what people are eating when they stop eating meat or stop drinking milk or stop eating eggs is ultra processed food. So to me, that is sort of at the crux of the danger of it. You're stopping eating something that we evolved with for millions of years. Our physiology is built on, reliance on it. And then you're substituting it with something that you're basically making yourself into a science experiment. Like, what are the long-term health effects of these foods that have just been invented in the last decade or so? And, I, for one, am not willing to subject myself to that science experiment, nor am I willing to subject my kids to that. So I try very, very hard to get as much food as possible from places that I know it was well raised, it was local. The vast majority of the meat that we eat is meat that we raise ourselves. Not everybody obviously has that option, but they can get it from good sources. It's available all over the country. And to try to make as much food as possible ourselves and have, as little processed food as possible. You're probably not going to ever totally get it out of your diet, but I'm working on it every day, trying to minimize it.
I love it. Nicolette, it is so wonderful to have you walk us through these issues in such a clear, cogent, compelling manner. So grateful we could have the time today for you to join us on the podcast. And before signing off to do our behind the scenes segment, I want to invite you to do two things. And the first is, I'm going to ask you this question. If you could wave your magic wand and help us envision what a fully regenerative food system looks like, and help us picture that, and also help us understand the steps we can take to get there, I'd love for you to share that with us. Okay.
So the first thing I would do, and this may sound like it's not related to regenerative agriculture, but I think it is my magic wand wave would give everyone on the planet the capacity to cook. Because again, the more I've learned and thought about this and read and talked to people over the years, the more convinced I am that when you are cooking, when you're gathering your own ingredients and preparing your own food and feeding people and feeding yourself with that food, you start to think about and you learn and you care about where it comes from, how it was produced, and you're going to be eating healthier food and you're going to be supporting a healthier food system. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is I would just get rid of all the big concentrated animal production facilities around the world, because I think that those places do not produce healthy food. They do not, they have tremendous environmental impacts and impacts for the neighbors and the people working there. And they do not create humane environments for the animals that live there. So I just really believe that as a human race, we should not be raising food that way. And then what I would want to do is take those animals and return them to the landscape around the world. Every farm would have lots of different things that it was doing. And actually, just a few months ago, I added to my presentations that I give, I added a slide from a Grandma Moses painting. And it was just this beautiful, I don't know if you've seen it before, Aaron, but it's just this beautiful painting of a farm with all different kinds of things happening on it. Lots of different people interacting with each other in different ways, and lots of different animals and plant crops. And you just see how a farm in a traditional setting is a community, and it's a place where there is community and where people are interacting with each other and with their animals and with their land, and how there's just connectedness happening naturally. And so to me, the return of the animals to the landscape and to more complex, more diverse farming that looks more like ecosystems rather than, factory production systems. To me, I think those are three things I've mentioned, three major shifts that I would like to see. And I think if just that happened, those are big things, but if those three things happened, we would be in a completely different place in terms of ecological health and in terms of our own health. And so those would be my magic wand steps.
I absolutely love it. And I love too that not only is this a big aspirational vision, and so many folks like you and your husband, like my friends here at Elk Run Farm and many others worldwide are moving in this direction. And it's so beautiful that we have the opportunity as humans to make these kinds of choices, and may we mobilize more and more in this direction together.
Yes.
Well, Nicolette, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's absolutely wonderful to have this time to visit with you.
Thank you for having me.
See ya.
Bye.
The Why on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit whyonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code WHYONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the whyonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Why on Earth community.